Over a year ago, I did a 2-hour long podcast type video on the complete history of the Kingdom of Rohan. At request, a month ago, I did another video, this time an hour 20, covering the complete history of the Kingdom of Arnor. I had a lot of fun making that video, so I wanted to do another. But this time, I wanted to change it up a little bit. Instead of covering a single kingdom, I wanted to cover a vast land and everything that went on there. And what land is more vast than Rhûn? What land had a more diverse history than Rhûn? What land is more shrouded in mystery than Rhûn? So in this podcast video, I'm going to cover the land of Rhûn, from the early days of the Middle Earth to the days of the Fourth Age. And if you haven't seen my Rohan or Arnor podcast videos, I would like to make a disclaimer. This is the type of video that you can treat as a podcast. There will be visuals, but it's not necessary to actually watch the video. You can instead listen to it, perhaps while you work, or work out, or play games, or while you're cooking, or while you're commuting, or while you're digging suspicious holes in your backyard that are definitely not body-shaped. Anyway, here we go. I hope you enjoy the ride. At the end of the Third Age, Rhûn had a negative connotation. It was associated with vast hordes of wicked men, moving west to attack the enemies of Sauron, putting both places and peoples to the sword. That is, however, unfair. Rhûn, as a word, just meant east in Sindarin. It was not the name of a kingdom or a people. It was a simple descriptor of the vast mysterious lands that were beyond the knowledge of people such as the Noldor or the Númenóreans. And the truth is, for people such as the Elves, Men, and even many of the Dwarves, Rhûn was where history began, and where plenty of history was made. Firstly, our knowledge of the geography of Rhûn is certainly not complete, especially considering how much the world changed from the First Age onwards. Our glimpse of Rhûn in the standard map of Middle-earth is perhaps the only part of Rhûn that has remained the same. These are the vast plains east of the Anduin and the Sea of Rhûn. Beyond that, we have little more than sketches. There's the mountain chain known as Oricani, the Red Mountains, and beneath it was the forest known as the Wildwood. There was also Cuiviénen, the shore besides the giant inland sea of Helcar where the elves first awoke, and beyond that was Hildorian, the land where men first awoke. While Oricani definitely still existed in the later ages, the status of the other places is completely unknown. For example, the Sea of Helcar was commonly believed to have dried up, and places such as the Sea of Rhûn and the Sea of Nirnen were mere remnants of the giant inland sea. But some of Tolkien's later writings that were uncovered proved that both the Sea of Rhûn and the Sea of Nirnen existed at the same time as the Sea of Helcar. The only place we know for certain that no longer existed was Cuiviénen. To there, it was said that there was no returning, implying that it had been destroyed at some point. But what this should all prove is that Rhûn, being a vast land, was home to many diverse landscapes. While the lands of Rhûn closest to the Westlands are associated with steppes, barren plains, and even deserts, it's clear that beyond that, Rhûn had a lot more to offer. Even around the Sea of Rhûn, one could find fertile lands that were perfect for the cultivation of wine, and vast forests that were home to many wild animals that attracted hunters from far abroad. I mentioned Cuiviénen before, and it's with Cuiviénen where the history of Rhûn truly begins. It was at Cuiviénen, on the shores of the Sea of Helcar, where the first 144 elves awoke. They would spend the next few centuries there, rapidly growing as the elves desired to bring more children into this exciting young world. But this excitement would quickly be blighted. Around 300 years into their existence, Melkor, Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, discovered the elves and started sending his servants to terrorize them. One such servant was only known as a rider, who would capture elves if they strayed too far. According to some theories, this is when Morgoth bred the first orcs from captured elves. Fortunately for the young elves, they would be discovered 50 years later by the Valar Orome. The elves are initially distrustful of Orome thanks to Morgoth's lies, but Orome manages to overcome this. He returns to Valinor, where it's decided that the Valar would make a war against Morgoth in order to protect the elves from him. It takes 100 years, but eventually Morgoth is defeated and dragged out of Utumno in chains. The elves were not ignorant to this war, as although most of it took place in the north and Cuiviénen was far away, such was the destruction that the whole continent rumbled, and fires and smoke could be seen from thousands of miles away. Returning to Cuiviénen 150 years after he first discovered the elves, Orome offered the elves an invitation to Valinor. This was initially rejected, so Orome settled on taking 3 elven ambassadors with him, Ingwe, Finwë, and Elwë. This proved mostly successful. The ambassadors return after a few decades and speak highly enough of Valinor that most of the elves are willing to leave. However, around 40% of the elves choose to remain behind, led by their leaders Nerwë and Morwë. These elves would be known as the Avari. As for the rest, now known as the Eldar, they pass around the northern side of the Sea of Helkar, where they get a better glimpse of the devastation of the war against Morgoth. At some point, they reach the Sea of Rhûn, and it's here that the Teleri, elves such as Círdan, learn the craft of shipbuilding, a trait that would define them in the years to come. Although the journey is slow and with many stops, the elves continue on, eventually passing out of Rhûn into the western lands. Few of these elves would ever return to Rhûn, so thus, as they leave Rhûn, they also leave our tale. As I said before, they left behind the Avari. Given how little a role the Avari played in the great events of Middle-earth, we actually know a decent amount about them. Although originally outnumbered by the Eldar, their numbers grew faster and they split into many different tribes and had many different languages. 6 tribes are known to us: the Kindi, the Quind, the Hwenti, the Windan, the Kinlai, and the Penny. Over time, many of the Avari, notably the Penny, began to drift westwards, some of them even merging with their kin, the Nandor, who ended up living in the forests of Rhovanion. Compared to the Eldar, the Avari were also quite primitive. Although still levels above early men, the Avari did not build great cities or forts, preferring to live in the caves or deep within the forests. Those that migrated often moved in small groups and were secretive, and sometimes treacherous with those Eldar who they deemed to have abandoned them. They were skilled in the arts of woodcraft and nature, but they had limited skill in metalwork, so they did not build weapons and armor for war. Unfortunately, if you believe that them having the East alone would result in a great time of peace and prosperity for the Avari, you are incorrect, as the Avari did not have the East alone. Morgoth may have been a prisoner in Valinor, but his servants still roamed the lands, notably Orcs. These eastern Orcs, now free of the hand of a Dark Lord, became wild, free, and strong, attacking not only each other, but anyone else they came across, regardless of their alignment. The Avari, as the original guardians of Rhûn, were certainly not immune to these attacks. The Avari and the Orcs were then joined by a new people, the Dwarves. It's not known exactly when the Dwarves first awoke. They were first sighted by the Elves in Beleriand around 2,000 years after the awakening of the Elves, so they awoke sometime before that. Of the 7 clans, 4 of them awoke in the east. The Iron Fists and the Stillbeards awoke together, and so did the Blacklocks and the Stonefoots. Unfortunately, we don't know any of the individual traits of these dwarven clans, perhaps other than what can be gleaned from their names. Although it's commonly believed that they awoke and made their abodes in Oricani, as that is the only confirmed mountain range in the east, it's never actually specified. The only information we have on that front is that their mansions and the Misty Mountains was greater than the distance between Gundabad and the Blue Mountains. But the true change in the east came about 2,500 years later. In the west, Morgoth had destroyed the 2 trees and escaped Valinor. As a replacement, the Vala created the sun and the moon, and with the first rising of the sun in the east, men awoke in the lands of Hildorian. What we know about the earliest years of men comes from the tale of Adanel, Adanel being the sister of Hador, leader of the 3rd House of the Edain. It paints a grim, dark picture, a picture that partially explains why, even thousands of years later, why the men of the East were hostile to those in the West. While some of it certainly isn't true, the broad strokes of the story seem to be accurate enough. When men first awake in Hildorian, they first hear the voice of Iluvatar, who explains their making and their purpose in the world. This satisfies them for a time, but men were curious and couldn't always find the answers concerning their surroundings themselves, so they appealed to Iluvatar for more and more help. However, Iluvatar wishes for men to understand things for themselves, and is not always forthcoming with answers. Now, most men become unsatisfied with the voice of Iluvatar, and thus Morgoth intervenes. This was around the time the Siege of Angband began in Beleriand. Morgoth, still having the capability to take a fair form, went east to Hildorian, although, fun fact, in later writings, Tolkien suggested that Sauron may have been responsible instead. Morgoth takes advantage of men's increasing difficulties with the voice of Iluvatar, labeling Iluvatar as the true evil, the voice of the dark, and that he wishes to devour them. When a solar eclipse occurs, men are afraid, and Morgoth tells them that only he can protect them from the dark. And in that moment, it's said that every living man bowed before Morgoth. He commands them to build a house of worship for him, and then the atrocities begin, including human sacrifice. After this, Iluvatar speaks again and apparently places his doom upon all men. According to the tale of Adanel, men were immortal at this time, but after the doom, they begin to age and die, and the land and its creatures turned against them. This part of the tale is likely untrue, but the next part definitely seems to be. Some men, realizing they had been deceived, fled from the east, although they were hunted by their kinsmen who remained behind. These men that fled would eventually become known as the three houses of the Edain: the House of Beor, the House of Halef, and the House of Hador. From the flights of these houses westwards, we actually learn a decent amount about Rhûn during this time. The House of Halef took a more southerly path alongside the Druidine, and they passed beneath Mordor and entered the Westlands through the land that would eventually be known as Gondor. But the other two houses, Beor and Hador, passed north, taking a route not too dissimilar to the Elves when they first marched westwards. Although both houses remained close to each other and spoke a very similar language, Talisker, there were some diversions. Notably, the House of Beor encountered a lot of Avari, who, as I said before, were primitive compared to the Noldor and the Sindar, but still far more advanced than men. As a result, the dialect of Talisker that they spoke became more influenced by Avaran words. On the other hand, the House of Hador encountered more dwarves, and their dialect of Talisker adopted a lot more Khuzdul words. Talisker would eventually evolve into Adunaic, and if you look at Adunaic, you can definitely see the Khuzdul influence. Another interesting fact is that while the House of Beor only had good encounters with the Avari, the House of Hador did have some bad encounters with the dwarves. In fact, it's suggested that at this time, some dwarves had become evil, apparently falling into the service of Morgoth. We don't know which dwarven clan it was, but fortunately, as later events would prove, it wasn't exactly a permanent alliance with the darkness. These two houses, at least for a time, would settle beside the shores of the Sea of Rhûn. The House of Beor would dwell in the unnamed hills and mountains southwest of the sea, whereas the House of Hador would dwell in the forests northeast of the sea. Both peoples would learn to build rudimentary boats and would spend time sailing the sea, but they still did not often encounter each other. As a result, the divergences in their languages continued, although they were both still at least somewhat mutually intelligible. But importantly, it's around this point where groups of men began to split off from the main houses. This happened plenty with the House of Halef in the south, and these groups, later known as the Pre-Numenorians, would settle much of the lands of Gondor and southern Eriador. Likewise, the Men of Beor would also have groups split off in Eriador, and they would come to be known as the Men of Eriador. But it's the House of Hador who concerns us the most. Even beginning at the shores of the Sea of Rhûn, groups began to split off, and later they would come to inhabit the vast lands between the Misty Mountains and the Sea of Rhûn. These men would come to be known as the Northmen, and as later events would show, their fates were often tied with what was going on in Rhûn, or what was emerging from it. The Edain then passed westwards, and thus they also pass out of our tale, but they were not the only men moving westwards. We're told that even after the Edain, peoples of men steadily drifted westwards, growing in number and strength as they went. Some of these groups were good, some of them were bad. Nowhere better is this demonstrated than with the group of men who would be known as the Easterlings of the First Age. These men were vastly different to the Edain, shorter, darker of skin, and broader of shoulder. They spoke a completely different language and were more warlike in nature. Probably owing to some of the events described in the Tale of Adanel, the Edain and these Easterlings never got along, so one could imagine that their journey west may have been filled with conflict against those Edain who had lingered and remained behind. And as history would tell us, while some of these Easterlings, those serving a man named Bor, were good and faithful, those serving another named Ulfang were treacherous and served Morgoth. And ultimately, it was Morgoth's servants and former servants who would dominate the East during the remainder of the First Age. As I said earlier, the Eastern Orcs, masterless and free, roamed across the land, and men were their newest victims, even those that served Morgoth. But men were also the victims of other men. Those who were the most devout servants of Morgoth rose up above their kinsmen and enslaved them, so even as Morgoth's focus was on the far western land of Beleriand, his dark influences could still be felt in the distant east of Rhûn. There was some reprieve following Morgoth's fall at the end of the First Age. Some of those that served him broke free of their shackles, at least for a time, but many of them were forever tainted by darkness and would carry that into the Second Age. Thus, when Sauron re-emerged at the beginning of the Second Age, it was in the East where he would have the most success in turning men to his cause, and under his guise of Anatar, the giver of gifts, Sauron was helpful towards these men, teaching them how to build settlements of stone and how to forge weapons of iron. Before I continue, I'll describe these men from this point on as Easterlings, but it's imperative to know that Easterlings, like Haradrim, was a broad term used to describe many groups of people who might not have been ethnically the same or spoke the same language. While distinct groups did emerge occasionally, it was basically, if you're from Rhûn, you're an Easterling. That's it. For example, while both described as Easterlings, those Easterlings of the First Age and those that emerged in the Second and Third Ages were not the same people. Likewise, the Easterlings who fought for Sauron at one period of time might have had absolutely nothing to do with Easterlings who fought for him at another period of time. Anyway, moving on. While Sauron did spread his influence in the East, he hadn't yet recruited armies. This is because, as Anatar, Sauron was trying to deceive the Elves, and any build-up of force near or in Mordor would have been noticed by the Númenóreans, who had already begun building outposts around the mouth of the River Anduin. Another interesting problem that Sauron faced was the Eastern Orcs, who were still terrorizing the east of Middle-earth. They were strong, warlike, perfect servants for Sauron, but under his disguise of Anatar, they disdained him and laughed at him. It was only after Sauron forged the One Ring, and the elves became aware of his true identity, when Sauron did away with any pretenses of stealth and began mustering the east against the west. But Sauron faced resistance. This came in the form of the two blue wizards, Alatar and Palando, or Morineta and Ramastamo, arriving in Middle-earth in 1600 of the Second Age, the same time Sauron forged the One Ring. They immediately went into the east, beyond the knowledge of those in the west, and although early writings speculated that they failed, either forging their own cults or even bowing to Sauron, later writings revealed that they were essential in making sure Sauron could not rally as much strength as he possibly could have. Thus, it seems likely that Rhûn and the East was in turmoil during these years, as Sauron tried to dominate the lands and the Blue Wizards rallied resistance against him. They continued to resist him all the way up to his final defeat, but in this case, by the end of the 17th century, Sauron wrongly believed that he had the manpower to take on the elves. We don't know the makeup of Sauron's armies during the following War of the Elves and Sauron in the middle of the Second Age. Given his main power base was in the east at the time, it's very likely that Easterlings made up a large portion of his armies. What we do know for certain is that when Sauron marched west, many Easterling peoples followed in his wake at his bidding. These Easterlings immediately clashed with the Northmen who lived in Rhovanion, west of the Sea of Rhûn. Although the Northmen had the Dwarves as allies, the Dwarves were facing their own problems, and the Northmen were left alone. They were numerous and valiant, but lacked the organisation nor the weapons of the Easterlings, and over the years that followed, the Easterlings absolutely devastated the Northman lands, and the Northmen, who were once spread across all of Rhovanion, now survived in isolated pockets, clinging to the mountains and forests. The war in the east was a sideshow. The main war was fought in Eriador, and there Sauron lost decisively thanks to Númenórean intervention, despite great successes at the start. The Númenóreans were now ascendant in Middle-earth. Most of their power was in the west and in the south, and although they did make voyages into the inner seas of Arda, presumably landing on the coastlines of eastern Rhûn, there's no evidence of them ever founding colonies there. In response, Sauron would double down in securing the east, between Sauron's dominion in the east and the ever-darkening Númenor's dominion in the south and west. The next millennium of the Second Age would be known as the Dark Years. Our information about what happened in Rhûn over the next 1500 years is scarce. The Eastern Orcs were no more, having been finally absorbed into Sauron's service. But as far as we know, the Blue Wizards were still active and attempting to keep men from being subjugated by Sauron. We know little of what was happening to the Avari at this time, other than we know that they still existed. As for the dwarves, at least some of them even fell into Sauron's service, just as some had served Morgoth during the First Age. One thing we know for certain is that Sauron gave a ring of power to an Easterling. This Easterling would eventually be known as Khamûl, the Shadow of the East, the second of the Nazgûl. The next time we know of Rhûn playing a major part in the events of Middle-earth is during the War of the Last Alliance. Thanks to Sauron, Númenor had destroyed itself, but Elendil and his sons founded the realms in exile, Gondor and Arnor. Having rebuilt his power since the War of the Elves and Sauron, Sauron sought to quickly end these two kingdoms and attacked Gondor in 3429. The War of the Last Alliance would last 12 years, the largest battle taking place on the battle plain of Dagorlad in 3434. Amongst Sauron's forces were his ever-faithful Easterlings, as well as a small number of Dwarves. But the might of Sauron's dominions in Mordor, the east and the south was not enough, and in 3441 the Last Alliance was victorious, although at great cost. Unfortunately, Sauron's defeat here did not break his grip on Rhûn, as, now bereft of his physical form, he was forced to flee into the far east of Middle-earth, where he was hunted by the Blue Wizards, although they failed to find him. Sauron chose Rhûn because the Easterlings had been the ones deepest in his service, just as they had been the deepest in Morgoth's service before him. They worshipped Sauron as a king and as a god, and retained a hatred for all things in the West, even after Sauron had been defeated. However, there were some positives. For example, the tide of Easterlings into Rhovanion was momentarily stemmed, allowing the Northmen to begin their long recovery. Also, the War of the Last Alliance is the last time we hear of the Eastern Dwarves actually siding with the forces of evil. It was Gondor that emerged the strongest from the War of the Last Alliance, and thanks to the decisiveness of Sauron's defeat, the kingdom would have peace for almost 500 years, but this came to an end in 490 of the Third Age. Driven by their hatred of Gondor, a horde of Easterlings attacked from between the Sea of Rhûn and the Ered Lifwi. We know almost nothing of these Easterlings, perhaps other than the fact that they were persistent and at least somewhat formidable, given the First War lasted for 10 years. But in 500, King Tarostar defeated them, and in commemoration of his victory, he took the name Remendikil, meaning East Victor. But these Easterlings were not going to be defeated that easily, and several decades later, they attacked Gondor again. They managed to avenge their defeat in 541 by killing Remendikil, the first, but certainly not the last Gondorian king to fall in battle against the Easterlings. Unfortunately for them, King Turambar was just as competent, if not more so than his father, and shortly afterwards he crushed the Easterlings and conquered territory all the way up to the Sea of Rhûn. Interestingly, this vast expanse was never given a name, and we're told that the Gondorians made very little attempt to settle it. They did, at one point, begin to build a road into the east, but this road never made it much further east than the Black Gate. An important consequence of this victory was that the Northmen of Rhovanion now found themselves under the protection of Gondor. They had been at the mercy of the Easterlings for so long, but now they were on the resurgence, and by the end of the first millennia of the Third Age, a powerful collection of Northman princes had emerged in the lands between Mirkwood and the Sea of Rhûn. They were favoured by the men of Gondor, but as Gondor's attention turned to the south, they were content with the status quo that was being maintained in the lands of Rhûn and Rhovanion. Gondor's wars against the Haradrim and the Black Númenóreans would see it reach the apex of its power and territory in 1050 of the Third Age. This would coincide with another major event. A shadow began to fall over the Forest of Greenwood. In truth, Sauron had returned and taken up residence in Dol Guldur, although this wasn't known to anyone. Unfortunately, after the death of King Jarmendikil I in 1149, Gondor would experience almost 100 years of stagnation and decay under the lazy rules of Atanatar Alcarin and, at least for a short while, his son, Narmakil. During this time, it's said that the enemies of Gondor saw cracks beginning to form, and this seems to have applied mostly to the Easterlings. We know this because in 1240, Narmakil made perhaps the only good decision of his reign. He named Minilcar, his nephew, as regent of Gondor. Minilcar was a strong, competent leader, more reminiscent of Jarmendikil than his father and uncle. His immediate issue was with the Easterlings. After almost 700 years, they were beginning to become a problem once again, particularly in regards to the Northmen of Rhovanion. You see, the Northmen at this time were not united, and sometimes were in conflict with each other. The Easterlings would get involved with these feuds, sometimes attacking the Northmen, but sometimes allying with them provided they received support of their own, and that support was usually Northman assistance in raiding Gondorian territory. For Minilcar, this was unacceptable. He needed the Northmen united and allied with Gondor, and the Easterlings were now trying to prevent that from happening. With the help of Vidugavia, the strongest of the Northman princes and the self-styled king of Rhovanion, Minilcar went to war with the Easterlings. In 1248, he defeats a large army of Easterlings and marches his forces beyond the Sea of Rhûn, burning the settlements and the camps of the Easterlings. Like his ancestor, Minilcar took the name of Remendekil II to commemorate his own victory. This was a massive defeat for the Easterlings because, once again, they basically disappear from the history books for centuries, and as a result, we know little of what was going on in Rhûn during this period, even as Gondor then had a devastating civil war and was then locked in a 200-year conflict with Harad and Umbar. The Easterlings were completely inactive, and things weren't about to get better for them. In the Westlands of Middle-earth, the most devastating event of the Third Age began in late 1635. This event was known as the Great Plague. It brought Rhovanion to its knees, it severely weakened Gondor, it destroyed Cardolan, and it devastated the land of the Shire. But the grim reality is that the Great Plague started somewhere in Rhûn, and even before it had reached the Westlands, it probably killed hundreds of thousands, if not millions. What makes this more grim is that it's theorized that the Great Plague was actually engineered by Sauron. If this was the case, it seems he had little concern with testing it and unleashing it on his own most loyal subjects first. But the damages of the Great Plague paved the road of success for a new group. This group was known as the Wainriders. You see, as I've said before, Rhûn was not a unified land, and when I refer to Easterlings, I refer to broad groups of people who probably didn't have a lot in common, except for perhaps their service to Sauron and their hatred of Gondor. So while the Easterlings often made incursions into the west, it must be remembered that they were also fighting each other, sometimes resulting in Sauron intervening to direct the focus of his subjects back towards the west. So while we don't know when it started or how it started, sometime in the 200 years following the Great Plague, the Wainriders started to rise to power. Gondorian scholars were uncertain whether they were a single tribe or a confederation of tribes, but what was quickly apparent is that the Wainriders were different. They were better armed, better organized, better trained, a true martial society where even the women, the old and the young were expected to fight. Their most standout characteristic was their use of wains, basically battle wagons or chariots that their chiefs would ride in, hence the name. Around 1850, even as the Gondorians were once again battling the Haradrim, the Wainriders first appeared on the borders of Rhovanion. Rhovanion had been severely weakened by the Great Plague, and even 200 years later it had yet to fully recover, so the Wainriders saw success in their invasion. In 1856, Rhovanion appealed to Gondor for aid, and King Narmakil II answered, taking an army into the plains south of Mirkwood to meet the Wainriders in battle. What followed was a decisive Wainrider victory at the Battle of the Plains. Narmakil II was killed, and the Gondorian army was forced to retreat, only saved from utter destruction thanks to a valiant rearguard of Northmen. This battle would have major consequences. It was perhaps the biggest defeat Gondor had suffered so far in its 2,000-year history, and as a result it was forced to abandon all of its lands beyond the Anduin except for Ithilien. Gondor was also forced to abandon Rhovanion to its fate, and the kingdom was conquered by the Wainriders over the next year, its people enslaved, with some managing to escape into Gondor or into the Vales of Anduin. The only silver lining for the Gondorians is that the Wainriders had also taken heavy casualties in the battle and were content with consolidating their gains instead of immediately invading Gondor. At this point, the Wainriders now separated into two groups. The Wainriders who had conquered Rhovanion and defeated Gondor now became known as the Wainriders of Rhovanion. Their focus was now on Gondor and the remnants of the Northmen. But further east, beyond the Sea of Rhûn, there was another group known as the Eastern Wainriders. Even as their western brethren were attacking Gondor, the Eastern Wainriders were attacking and conquering other Easterling peoples, and at one point, they even came into conflict with the men of Kharn to the south. Gondor had some time to recover, but war erupted again in 1899. King Hallimar was keen to avenge the Battle of the Plains, and he got his chance when Marwini, the Lord of the Aethiod, those surviving Northmen who had fled to the Vales of Anduin, informed him of a Northman rebellion brewing in Rhovanion. He also warned that the Wainriders were planning to raid Carlanadon. Hallimar decided to strike first, drawing the Wainriders into battle upon the plains of Dagorlad. Once again, it was a hard-fought, bloody battle that was in doubt for a time, but with the help of a flanking maneuver by the Aethiod, the Wainriders were defeated and were forced to flee after losing a third of their force. they would lose even more as the Aethioid viciously pursued them across the plains. In Rhovanion, the uprising went off as planned. Northmen fugitives hiding in Mirkwood riled up their enslaved brethren while the Wainrider army was away, and the rebels were successful in burning many of the dwellings of the Wainriders, as well as their storehouses and their fortified camps. But this success came with a massive cost. Amongst the Wainriders, both the youth and the old men were expected to fight, as were the young women in defense of their homes. Instead of a soft underbelly, the rebels found a bloodbath and most of them perished in the fighting, and the Northmen were unable to reclaim their old home. This showed the resilience of the Wainriders. Despite the defeat of their army and the damages done to their new homes, they were not about to concede defeat. Instead, the Wainriders of Rhovanion decided to enlist the help of the Eastern Wainriders, who then made peace with the men of Khand and Harad. To make matters worse, they then actually allied with them, and it was decided that they would launch a joint attack on Gondor from both the north and south. They believed this overwhelming force was necessary, as the Wainriders actually knew very little about the lands beyond the Anduin and assumed Gondor was far stronger than it was. And once again, it was later believed that Sauron played a part in negotiating the peace and the alliance that would surely destroy Gondor. In 1944, the time for the invasion had come, but King Ondahur was ready thanks to the efforts of Forthwini, the Lord of the Aethioid. He split Gondor's army in two. The southern army under General Adanel would meet the Haradrim in southern Ithilien, whereas King Ondahur would lead the northern army to face the Wainriders upon the plain of Dagorlad. On Dagorlad, the Wainriders would once again surprise the Gondorians with their prowess. They ambushed the Gondorian army as it was deploying, and King Ondahur and both of his sons were killed in an event known as the Disaster of the Morannon. It's said that perhaps the victory was too swift, as at least half of the Gondorian army had yet to deploy, and was then able to retreat into Ithilien without giving proper battle. In the south, things didn't go well for the Haradrim. They crossed the Poros and were then ambushed by Adanel and were utterly crushed. But the Wainriders were not aware of this, and believed Gondor to be defenseless. In a major lapse of judgment, they had a feast in Ithilien, believing the path across the Anduin to be open. Unknown to them, Adanel had marched north and made contact with the remnants of the northern army. He then attacked the Wainriders as they feasted in a battle known as the Battle of the Caps. The Wainriders were utterly annihilated, and most of those who escaped were driven into the Dead Marshes, where they also perished. Interestingly, the defeat at the Battle of the Camps seems to have had led to the disintegration of Wainrider power, despite the fact that Gondor didn't actually invade Rhovanion or Rhûn afterwards. The reason for this could be that during the battle, the Wainriders' most prominent leaders were killed, and the Confederation then may have just collapsed. But the collapse of the Wainrider power didn't mean that the Easterlings just disappeared. They remained just beyond the Anduin, numerous yet disorganized. And as for the Northmen, only few of them remained in their ancestral land. Their main power was now beyond Mirkwood in the Vales of Anduin. But although the lands beyond the Anduin were considered lost to Gondor, I do want to point out that going beyond wasn't exactly a death sentence following the defeat of the Wainriders. We know this because Steward Verondil, who lived between 1919 and 2029, was a keen hunter, and his most prized possession was a hunting horn fashioned from the horn of a kine of Aror, who lived exclusively by the shores of the Sea of Rhûn. This was the same horn that Boromir carried 1,000 years later. A little over 100 years after the defeat of the Wainriders in 2063, the Watchful Peace would begin, the result of Gandalf investigating Dol Guldur, causing Sauron to flee back into the east. We don't know what he was up to there. Presumably, like usual, nothing good. And it's important to know that in 1980, the Nazgûl reoccupied Mordor and began to remilitarize the Long Silent Land. To feed Mordor's new military machine, the fields of Nirn to the south needed to be worked, in this case from slaves, mainly from the east of Middle-earth. There's a lot of other hints that suggest that during this time, Rhûn was suffering quite a lot of turmoil, but I'll get to that piece by piece. But what the Watchful Peace meant for the West was, well, peace. In their lands beyond the Anduin and the Sea of Rhûn, the Easterlings were inactive, just as they had been several times in the past. But this changed shortly after the Watchful Peace ended in 2460. Gondor began to experience attacks from Mordor and the Corsairs, but when Cirion became steward in 2489, his attention was focused on the north. beyond the undeeps of the Anduin, the Easterlings were gathering once again. They were called the Balchoth. Now, the Balchoth isn't what they called themselves. The word Balchoth literally means horrible horde, and a horde they were, being extremely numerous. While they were undoubtedly related to the Wainriders, they did at least lack the organisation and the weapons of the Wainriders, but quantity has a quality of its own. Hard-pressed in the east and south, Steward Kirion was concerned that the Wainriders would attack Calanadon, and therefore be able to attack Gondor from the north. His scouts kept an eye on them, but many of them would perish in doing so. In 2510, it was clear that the Balchoth were about to attack. In desperation, Kirion decided to call upon the Aethiod for aid. They now lived in the upper vales of Anduin and had not aided Gondor in any wars for over 400 years. Nevertheless, one of Kirion's messengers made it through, the legendary Borondir Udalrath, and the mounted army of Ael the Young rode south in haste. They did so not a moment too soon. The Balchoth had crossed the Undeeps and were ravaging Calanadon. The northern army of Gondor, led by Kirion himself, met them in the Wold, but were pushed back across the River Limelight and then back towards the Anduin. They were also then attacked by an army of Orcs from the Misty Mountains. Fortunately, Ael the Young arrived just in time. The Orcs were destroyed and the Balchoth were driven back across the Limelight. Many of them had remained behind to ravage Calanadon, but they were driven to panic by their fleeing brethren, and many of them were destroyed as the Aethiod horsemen pursued them across the plains. For saving him, his army, and potentially all of Gondor, Kirion would end up rewarding Ael the Young with Calanadon, which would become Rohan, and Ael would be remembered as its first king. This reignited the old feud between the Northmen, now the Rohirrim, and the Easterlings, because even though the Balchoth had been defeated, they were not destroyed. The Balchoth, or a group related to them, invaded Rohan again just a few decades later in 2545, and Ael was killed whilst fighting in the Wold. Although Ael's son, Brago, would defeat the Easterlings and secure the Wold, the Easterlings would return again in 2758, conquering the east of Rohan while the Dunlendings conquered the west. Unfortunately for the Easterlings, it was not the Rohirrim who defeated them this time, but the climate. The long winter followed their invasion, forcing them to make camp in the valleys of the River Antwash. When the snows melted following the winter, many of the Easterlings in their camps were destroyed in the floods, and the remaining Easterlings were forced to withdraw back across the Anduin. I now want to take some time to focus on the Far East a little more. As I spoke about earlier, it seems the Blue Wizards were still active at this point, continuing to hinder Sauron's plans, although unable to completely foil them. The fact that Sauron had not yet managed to destroy them points towards their skill and perseverance. We also don't know too much about the Avari. Some had drifted westwards, merging with the Elves of Mirkwood or Lorien, but we're told that none could be found west of the Misty Mountains. Evidently, most of them were still in the east, but their numbers and their state of being isn't told. But we do know a bit about the dwarves. In the past, at least some of the dwarves of the east had allied with evil, but this seems to have changed following the Second Age. However, the last third of the Third Age was a tumultuous time for the dwarves, not just for the Longbeards, but also seemingly for the dwarves of the east. We're told that the Longbeards weren't the only ones who had troubles with dragons. The Eastern Dwarves did too, resulting in a minimum of 2 of the Eastern Dwarven clans losing their rings of power to dragons, and losing their dwarf hordes in the process, implying that some of these dwarves, like the Longbeards, lost their homelands to dragons. So, we can add dragons to the list of peoples who inhabited Rhûn at one point or another. The exact timing of these events is unknown. At the very least, all of the Eastern Dwarven clans were in a good enough position to be able to help the Longbeards during the War of the Dwarves and Orcs from 2793 to 2799. This was done to avenge King Thror by killing Azog, which was achieved at the Battle of Azanul Bazaar in 2799. But all of the Dwarven clans took heavy casualties during this war, and understanding that they were going to leave empty-handed, the Eastern Dwarven clans refused to help King Thrain in potentially retaking Moria, Balrog or no. Later, in the lead up to the War of the Ring, far to the west in the Shire, Frodo would encounter strange dwarves passing through. Given that Frodo was well acquainted with the Longbeards and those dwarves that lived in places such as the Blue Mountains, it's speculated that the dwarves that were passing through were refugees from Rhûn. This implies that the fortunes of the Eastern Dwarves had not turned for the better, as they had for the Longbeards, and that their cities and holds in the east may have been ruined or under attack, possibly from forces loyal to Sauron. Speaking of the War of the Ring, this is the next time the peoples of Rhûn play a role in the events of the Westlands of Middle-earth. In preparation for his final assault upon the Free Peoples, Sauron was rallying forth all of his power from the east. When Frodo is atop Amon Hen, from Rhûn he sees endless hordes of men, swordsmen, spearmen, mounted bowmen, chariots, and wains laden with all the provisions of war. Again, at the Black Gate, Frodo sees more armies of Easterlings marching into Mordor. These are spearmen, and besides them ride many companies of cavalry. Some of the Easterlings that Sauron rallied had never been seen before in the West, such as the bearded axemen who took part in the capture of Caer Andros. Once again, as I have repeated several times throughout this video, it seems that the Blue Wizards were continuing to hinder Sauron at this time, and as Tolkien put it, their efforts ensured that Sauron was unable to fully muster the might of the East, who easily outnumbered the West. Another problem for Sauron is these war plans ended up being rushed, first by the betrayal and failure of Saruman, and second due to his belief that Aragorn was wielding the One Ring. As a result, it's probable that there were still forces marching west to serve Sauron by the time the war was actually over. But those Easterlings that did arrive would play an important role for Sauron in the War of the Ring. On top of being numerous, they're also described as some of Sauron's best fighters, ferocious, battle-hardened, slow to surrender or flee, and even willing to fight to the death. As I said before, some of them are involved in the capture of Caer Andros, and along with a force of Orcs, they dig in along the road to stop any reinforcements arriving from Rohan. At the Battle of Pelennor Fields, they mostly wait in reserve and are deployed by Gothmog after the destruction of the Witch King, and after the defeat of the Morgul host, many of these Easterlings fight to the death. They're seen again as the host of the West marches towards the Black Gate. A force of Orcs and Easterlings attempts to ambush the army, but unfortunately for them, they're attempting to ambush them at the same spot the Rangers of Ithilien ambushed the Haradrim only a few weeks earlier. Yet another army of Easterlings makes an appearance at the Battle of the Black Gate. They emerge from the foothills of the Ered Lifwi to the east and block any chance of retreat for Aragorn's army. Once Sauron is destroyed, most of these Easterlings do flee, but a few surrender, and those deepest in Sauron's service still fight to the death. But perhaps the greatest moment for the Easterlings came in the north. After the dwarves of Erebor and the men of Dale had rejected any cooperation with Sauron, Sauron directed an army of Easterlings to destroy them. They first met the forces of Dale at the River Carnan and swiftly pushed them back. 3 days later, they fought a combined army of dwarves and Dalemen at the Battle of Dale, and were victorious, killing both King Brand and King Dain Ironfoot. The survivors did manage to retreat inside Erebor, which was besieged. Notably, this was Sauron's only army in the northern theatre of the war to score a victory, but unfortunately for them, they received word of Sauron's defeat, crushing their morale and allowing the dwarves and Dalemen to sally forth and eventually defeat them. What happened in Rhûn following Sauron's defeat is unknown, but considering the fact that the Easterlings were, historically, Sauron's most devout followers, it was probably a time of chaos and power vacuums. Unlike some of the Haradrim who immediately sent peace envoys to King Aragorn the Lesser after he was crowned, the Easterlings did not, although Aragorn did release the few prisoners that he had taken. And like in Harad, we're told that during Aragorn's reign, Gondorian forces did fight in far-off Rhûn, where they were joined by their allies, King Eomer and the Rohirrim. So, at the very least, despite Sauron's defeat, hostilities did not end. So, what happened in Rhûn in the Fourth Age and beyond? Well, for one, we're told that of the wizards, only Gandalf returned to Valinor, meaning that the Blue Wizards seemingly stayed in the East even after their work was done, assuming they weren't killed in the end. As for the Avari, they would have shared the same fate as all elves in Middle-earth. They would have faded, becoming nothing more than spirits inhabiting their old homes. As for the dwarves, they would also share the fate of the elves, and would eventually dwindle and die out. Like all places, Rhûn would become solely a dominion of men, and eventually, as the ages went on and the world changed, some of the lands that made up Rhûn would have become places in our own world: Central Asia, India, China, and others. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I know Rune is a super interesting topic to many people, so I decided, hey, why not make an entire podcast video dedicated to everything we know about Rune? Because having done a quick scan of YouTube, most videos have only gone for about 10 to 15 minutes, so I hope this much longer one satiates your desire for knowledge. If you have any suggestions for more complete history type videos, please let me know in the comments, but other than that, cheers, farewell, and remember, if you ever feel lazy, just remember elven cartographers looked at an entire landmass, shrugged their shoulders, and then just went, east, that'll do.